Alright, I'm going to go ahead and begin. This is the last class session in an 8-week series called Understanding Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. We did 4 weeks on Mormonism, and we are concluding our 4-week series on Jehovah's Witnesses. This course is part of the theology program. It's an elective in the theology program, which is part of the Reclaiming the Mind Ministries. And I'm very happy to be associated with the theology program in this way. This is actually the 3rd course that I've had the pleasure of teaching with the theology program, and it's always been a blessing. Always had good conversations with folks, good questions. And, of course, we've had our fair share of hecklers as well, but I guess that's part of the fun in some ways. In this concluding session on Jehovah's Witnesses, we are going to be talking about the eschatology of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, don't let this fancy word eschatology throw you. Of course, those of you who are in the theology program, I'm sure are already familiar with this term. It's simply a 50-cent word for the study of the end of the last things, and specifically having to do with such issues as death, what happens after you die, heaven and hell, all of those sorts of things. And so we're going to be looking at what Jehovah's Witnesses say on this subject and contrasting it, comparing it with what the Bible says. Now, I should tell you that Jehovah's Witnesses rarely receive any kind of effective or cogent response to what they believe on this subject. Perhaps more than any other topic, Jehovah's Witnesses feel very confident that their views on the subjects of death and hell and all things related to those subjects, that their view is the biblical view, and that what you find in Orthodox Christianity is not the biblical view. And they're half right in that, or maybe a quarter right, in that a lot of views that are popular within Christianity, that are part of the popular kind of folk Christianity historically, are ideas that are not actually biblical. And just to confuse matters, some of the words that are used are not biblical words, or they're not being used in biblical ways, even though at times they are expressing a biblical concept, perhaps not very well. So this is an area where Christian theology has had some catching up to do, not catching up with Jehovah's Witnesses by any means, but catching up with the Bible. And eschatology has been an area of intense interest within Christianity for the past 2 centuries, and ironically, most of this interest has been frittered away in irrelevancies, in speculations, in games of trying to interpret various Bible prophecies in relation to current events, a game that a friend of mine, Bill Alner, calls Pin the Tail on the Antichrist. And a lot of the efforts of Bible-believing Christians over the past couple hundred years in the area of eschatology has been devoted to this kind of diversion away from sound biblical understanding of eschatology. Meanwhile, various religious groups, and most notably the Jehovah's Witnesses, have tried to capitalize on the widespread ignorance and confusion about biblical eschatology by advancing their own theology as the true understanding of what the Bible says on these subjects. So what we're going to be doing tonight is, in a short period of time, trying to sort out some of this stuff and bring some clarity to what the Bible says on the subject in relation to what Orthodox Christianity historically teaches, as well as what Jehovah's Witnesses teach. Now, if you want to get more in depth than what we can do in this time, of course, there's a brief treatment on eschatology, on these types of topics in the book called Jehovah's Witnesses that I wrote, that is published by Zondervan, and that was mentioned in the syllabus for those of you that got a copy of this. But an even more in-depth treatment is found in a book that I co-authored called Sense and Nonsense About Heaven and Hell. Sense and Nonsense About Heaven and Hell. I'd like to mention this book to you because it will give you much more in-depth examination of specific biblical passages, the exegesis, if you will, of these texts, than I'll be able to do in our discussion, although we'll try to get into that as much as we can. So let me just recommend, or if I might, refer you to that book, Sense and Nonsense About Heaven and Hell, if this topic is of interest to you. Now, I want to start by talking about what in the world we mean by hell. Such a short little English word, so much confusion over this one word. It turns out that there is a lot of confusion over the meaning of the word hell, and the root of the problem goes back to the older English translations of the Bible, including the King James Version. Now, I'm not one of these persons who's on a kick all the time to knock the King James Bible. I certainly do knock the King James only position, the kind of cultish devotion to the King James Version as the only acceptable English version of the Bible. But here, this might be an example of why such a position is untenable, but I'm not being critical of the King James Version, just noting that there was an inadvertent confusion that arose because of a translation choice made in the King James Version. When we ask the question, what is hell? What do most people think of? Well, most people think of hell as the place of eternal punishment, as the realm or condition of the lost for eternity, that is described in the book of Revelation as the lake of fire, or lake of fire and brimstone. And so they think of hell as the place of eternal punishment. Now, it turns out that the English word hell is used in the Bible to translate two different Greek words in the New Testament. And this may be at least part of the confusion, although both of these words might refer to eternal punishment in some sense, but there's a little bit of a problem with that. So I'm going to try to explain this, and there's a little bit of technical stuff here in that we're looking at specific Greek words, but I don't think it's too hard to follow. The two Greek words in question here are Hades and Gehenna. Hades and Gehenna. These are both Greek words. Hades is in ancient Greek, it is the traditional Greek term for the abode of the dead, the realm of the dead. That's where you go when you die. It doesn't matter who you are. In Greek thought, in Greek religious mythology, in Greek religious terminology, Hades is the realm of the dead. All human beings go there when they die, without exception. You die, you go to Hades. Hades is a realm of the dead that is not exactly a wonderful place to be, but it wouldn't necessarily be equated with hell in the strict sense. That is, with what we call hell with a capital H being the place of eternal punishment. In Greek thought, they did not divide the afterlife into a realm of blessedness and a realm of punishment. There was a division. It was the realm of the living, where we are now, and the realm of the dead. And if you were dead, you were in Hades automatically. It wasn't a great place to be. Anybody who was in Hades would rather be alive on the earth. They would rather be among the living than among the dead. But nevertheless, it is a realm of the dead. Gehenna is a different word, and it is not a word that is specifically related to any kind of Greek religious terminology or Greek religious thought. Gehenna is a kind of a Greek form of a Hebrew expression meaning of Hinnom, and referring to the valley of Hinnom in the Jerusalem area, right outside Jerusalem. And it became used in ancient Jewish language as a way of referring to a place of punishment for the wicked. Now, these are two different words, and yet the King James Version translates both of them with the English word hell, which raises some questions as to whether Hades and Gehenna are really two different descriptions of the same thing, the same place, or if they are different places. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses take the view that when you die, you cease to exist. You, the person, no longer exist when you are dead. Now, your life force is in the custody of Jehovah God, and He can recreate you as a person whenever He wants to do that. But He is just holding on to your life force until that future day. In the meantime, between your death and resurrection, if you get one, and not everybody does, but a lot of people do, most people do, between your death and resurrection, you just don't exist. And we talked about this last week briefly, that Jehovah's Witnesses, in thinking that when you're dead, you're non-existent, at least as a person. Clearly, if you take that view, it makes no sense whatsoever to think that Jesus Christ is God, because if Jesus Christ is God, He can't stop existing, not for 3 milliseconds, not for 3 nanoseconds, let alone 3 days. But Jehovah's Witnesses take the view, of course, that Jesus Christ is not God, and that death is annihilation, or the cessation of existence. You cease to exist. Well, then what about this term Hades? As I said, it's a Greek term for the realm of the dead. Not in Greek thought, not intermediate, because there's no escaping Hades, but it's the realm of the dead. And it would be very similar, but not identical, to what Christians historically have understood by the intermediate realm of the dead. It is an abode of spirits, the departed spirits of human beings. Their spirits have been set, or souls, either which term can be used, are separated from their bodies. The spirits they're not exactly alive, but they exist. They're personal beings, less than they are supposed to be, but they're personal entities existing in the abode of the dead, awaiting the resurrection. The only difference then, or not the only difference, but the main difference between Hades as Greeks thought of it, and Hades, or the intermediate realm of the dead as Christians thought of it, was that you could escape the realm of the dead in Christian thought in the resurrection. But in Greek thought, there's no resurrection from the dead. So Hades in Greek, in the New Testament, you would expect, if the New Testament uses the term Hades, that it would refer to some kind of realm of the dead where people go and they still exist as persons without their bodies. And in fact, that does seem to be what it means in the New Testament. The famous example of this is the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where there's an adaptation of the Greek language because the rich man goes to Hades, whereas Lazarus, the poor man, goes to the side of Abraham, Abraham's bosom, which means that he's right there beside Abraham, lounging around, eating and being taken care of right there next to Abraham. But the rich man is in Hades, and he's suffering in Hades, which is basically what Greeks thought you would do if you went to Hades. It was not going to be a pleasant experience. But in Jesus' story of Lazarus and the rich man, Hades is a horrible place. The rich man is suffering torment and flames, and very much existing, and very much lamenting the fact that he is existing, and extremely unhappy about the situation. Well, that sounds like the traditional concept of hell, and it sounds very much like what we would expect from the Greek term Hades being used. But Jehovah's Witnesses claim, well, you can't take that literally because this is a parable. Now, some evangelical Christians, by the way, let me just pause for a second here and ask that you confirm, if you're hearing me, that you can hear me by typing Y for yes or 1 for no or something. Good. Just want to make sure every once in a while that I'm being heard. Jehovah's Witnesses, like Adventists, by the way, Adventists have the same view, basically, about death, and also deny eternal punishment for the wicked. Jehovah's Witnesses claim, well, this is a parable, and since it's a parable, you can't take it literally. And there are things in the story that probably cannot be taken literally. Disembodied souls cannot dip fingers in water. A literal conversation between Abraham and the rich man across the divide seems to be impossible. These kinds of elements in the story do seem to be something that you can't take literally. But from this fact that there are non-literal elements in the story, you cannot conclude that Hades here simply means non-existence, death as ceasing to exist. Clearly, Jesus uses the term Hades here because it is the best term available, or let's put it this way, the author of the Gospel of Luke, who's quoting whatever Jesus said in Aramaic, presumably, is using the Greek word Hades here as the best equivalent term. And I would submit that if he does that, it's because he thinks that when you die, you actually go somewhere that's not terribly pleasant. And if you're an unbeliever, it's in fact downright horrible, and you want to avoid that if at all possible. So I would suggest that this story of Lazarus and the rich man is in Luke 16, verses 19 to 31, supports the position that Hades is a realm of the dead, that there is a realm of the dead where people go. By the way, some Orthodox Christians respond to this argument from Jehovah's Witnesses by saying, well, it's not a parable because parables don't name individuals, don't give the names of individuals, and Lazarus is mentioned by name in this particular story, and therefore they argue that this story is an actual historical account. Jesus is telling people about an actual person named Lazarus and an actual person who was a rich guy who ended up in the tormenting flames of Hades. I'm sorry, I don't think that argument will work because I think it is a parable. It starts out the way other parables in Luke start. Some of the other parables in Luke start out. Now there was a rich man, and when Jesus starts off a story, now there was this rich guy. That it's not going to be good for the rich guy, and that it's a story that he made up to illustrate the dangers, the pitfalls that face rich people who forget about God. Well, one of the main reasons Jehovah's Witnesses give why Hades must be understood to mean simply the realm of the grave. They argue that Hades is not an actual abode or realm of the dead, but that it must simply refer to the grave, to death as a state or condition of basically non-existence, is that the Greek word Hades is used in the New Testament to translate the Hebrew word Sheol found in the Old Testament. I told you this was going to get a little bit technical. I'm going to get past all this pretty quickly here, but this is so basic that if you want to have any kind of a chance of having an intelligent conversation with Jehovah's Witnesses about hell, you need to know these three words: the Hebrew word Sheol and the two Greek words Hades and Gehenna. Well, the Hebrew word Sheol is translated Hades in the New Testament. Just a few times, but it does get translated that way. And Jehovah's Witnesses argue, and they're not alone, that Sheol is the grave. In fact, the New International Version, under the influence of one of its chief translators, Laird Harris, usually, not always, but usually translates Sheol as grave. And, I personally think this is a mistake, but it's something that you find biblical scholars debating. Recent scholarship, I would argue, has tilted the scales away from this view. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of people arguing that Sheol was not any kind of an intermediate realm of the dead. It was not an abode of the dead. It was not a place where disembodied spirits went, but it was just the grave. But that is not holding up in the light of the best scholarship, the best studies of the biblical terminology and language in the Old Testament compared to that of other cultures. It turns out that Sheol the depiction of Sheol in the Old Testament matches very nicely with the surrounding culture's imagery of, again, some kind of less than wonderful existence beyond the grave. An existence that, generally speaking, is unpleasant and you want to avoid. In the Old Testament, Sheol is compared to a pit in which people are thrown alive. They're tossed alive down into Sheol in Numbers 16, for example, verses 30 and 33. And there are many other places. In fact, let me give you an example where even the NIV could not use the term grave. Deuteronomy 32:22, Moses warned that the Israelites that God's anger kindles a fire that burns to the depths of Sheol. And the New International Version translates, burns to the realm of death below. Well, clearly in that context, even the NIV translators came to the conclusion that this is a realm of the dead that is a very unpleasant prospect for the people who are living on the earth. I could give a lot of other evidences throughout the Old Testament that Sheol is really a kind of punishment. It is someplace that you desperately want to be delivered from because it is evil. It is not simply non-existence, but it just, if you look through the Old Testament references to Sheol, get a concordance, get one of these Bible software programs where you can look up a word and find it everywhere in the Old Testament or the New Testament. There's many of these now, and you can see for yourself. One of the most colorful of these passages would be Isaiah 14, verses 9 through 11. Verses 9 to 11 of Isaiah chapter 14, where the dead are pictured as shades, Rephaim, spirits who are in Sheol, waiting to greet other people who come down to the realm of the dead, where they are saying to them, "You have become weak like we. You have become like us." Basically taunting the powerful who die and saying, "You're just as bad off as we are now." So that is a picture, an imagery that assumes that Sheol is a realm of the dead. Now you say, why is this so important? Well, because Jehovah's Witnesses want to argue that death simply brings an end to existence, because that is the easiest way to avoid, from any kind of even seemingly biblical perspective, the idea that the wicked are going to suffer eternally as a result of their disbelief and their rebellion against God. Now, before I get into that issue of death a little bit more directly, let me say something about Gehenna. Gehenna is a term that is used in the New Testament almost exclusively by Jesus. And it was already being used in the Judaism of Jesus' day as a reference to a realm of punishment for the wicked. So Jesus is simply taking over that usage and applying it and saying, let me tell you who's going to end up in hell, in Hades. It's not just murderers. It's also people that hate their brother. It's not just adulterers. It's people who lust after another woman, someone else's wife. The argument that Jesus was having with his Jewish contemporaries was not over whether there is a hell, whether there is a realm of punishment for the wicked. The issue is that Jesus is raising that the standard for escaping hell is much, much higher, much stricter than what a lot of people in his day were teaching. So with this background that there's these two different Greek words, Hades and Gehenna, and then the Old Testament word Sheol, and it might help to kind of keep these distinct a little bit. Let me go on. But before I go on, I do want to say something about this idea, and I see somebody's already asking about this, that Gehenna was the city dump, basically, outside Jerusalem, that it was the place where the trash was dumped outside Jerusalem. And then some Jehovah's Witnesses and Adventists and people who have this kind of same view have argued that the metaphor of the city dump favors the view that the wicked are just destroyed in hell. You take out the trash, you dump it, you burn it, it's gone, it's the end. However, it turns out, did some research on this, I mentioned this in the book, that this idea of Gehenna as the city dump comes from a medieval source dated to about AD 1200. In other words, 11 and a half centuries after Jesus. That's way too late to read that back into the New Testament. I mean, it's possible that was a view that was around in the first century and we just don't know about it, but our earliest evidence for the view is more than 1,000 years after Jesus, so I think that just needs to be ignored in terms of trying to understand what the language means. Now, what is death? Let me get right to this, because I think this is really crucial. Again, Jehovah's Witnesses teach that when you die, you cease to exist. You just pass into nothingness. You may, for a brief moment, as death is coming upon you, be filled with regret that you have missed it. You may realize in your dying moment that you missed God, you missed eternal life, and you may have a moment of regret, but basically when you die, you just don't exist anymore. So the dead don't know anything, the dead aren't sorry about anything, the dead don't regret anything. You're not there, because there's nothing there, there's no one there. No one's home. Now, is this, there's some biblical language that people have read and interpreted to mean this, but if you look at the whole spectrum of biblical language, biblical speech in relation to death, you get a more complex picture. Let me just read a list here for you of biblical idioms or biblical ways of speaking about death. I'll just give you these one after the other. To expire, to depart, Philippians 1:23. We'll have more to say about that later if I have time, because the Jehovah's Witnesses don't translate it depart. Philippians 1:23, to depart. To be no more, and that sounds like you don't exist anymore. Some people have latched onto that one in Psalm 37:10. Here's a one that's very common in biblical language: to be gathered to one's people, or to gathered to one's fathers. To be cut off from the land, to be cut off from one's family, to be cut off from the land of the living, to be cut off from the nation. Cutting off is a very common idiom in biblical language, Old Testament language, for death. To perish, another term that is used. And you could see how be no more and maybe expire sounds like you don't exist anymore. But other language sounds like you do. To depart. Oh, I didn't mention a couple of these. To sleep. Sleep is familiar to us in the New Testament as well. To sleep, for example, in 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul says that, not all sleep. Jesus used this idiom. He said that the dead person that somebody was crying over wasn't really dead, but just asleep. Well, asleep to him because he could wake her up whenever he wanted to. In fact, he did. He raised her from the dead. To depart, to sleep, to be gathered to one's people. Oh, here's another one. To lie down with one's fathers. To lie down with one's fathers. Another biblical idiom for dying. Now, the idiom of being gathered to one's fathers or gathered to one's people probably reflects the idea of the dead being united with their ancestors in some kind of afterlife. This is what most cultures believe. And this is how they would talk about it. I'm going to be with my ancestors. I'm going to lie down with my fathers. I'm going to be gathered to my fathers. Those are not just biblical idioms for death, but they're, with some variations, common ways of speaking about death in most cultures. And most cultures have believed in some kind of existence beyond the grave. Now, here's I think, the crux of the problem. And that is that Jehovah's Witnesses assume that to be dead means to cease existing. And that is not a biblical definition. To die means to stop living, but not to stop existing. Now, here's where I think Christians sometimes get themselves into a little bit of semantic trouble. Because you'll hear Christians say something like this: you're going to live forever. The only question is whether you're going to live forever in heaven or live forever in hell. Now, there's some other problems with that, but we'll get to that in a bit. But the idea that you're either going to live forever in hell or live forever in heaven, either way you're living forever, that's not a biblical way of speaking. When you're dead, you're dead. But that doesn't mean that you're non-existent. The dead are not alive in hell or anywhere else. They're not alive, but they're not non-existent either. Well, then what is life? Well, it's more than just existing, right? Rocks exist, but they're not alive. Dead bodies exist, but they're not alive. To be alive means to be in a realm of activity in which relationship is possible, in which participation in the world, participation in history, participation in community is possible. And you can't have that if you're dead. When you're dead, you can't have fellowship, relationship with your family because you're dead. You can't sit down to a meal with them. You can't talk to them. They can't talk to you. You're cut off from the land of the living. And this is how the Bible routinely speaks about death. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses take a variety of verses out of context, a proof text method of the worst kind, to try to prove that death means non-existence. I can't go through all of these, but let me give you a couple examples. Psalm 146, verse 4. Psalm 146, verse 4 says, and I'm quoting, "His spirit departs, he returns to the earth. In that very day his thoughts perish." And Jehovah's Witnesses and Adventists say, see, when you die, you stop thinking. And the reason why you stop thinking is because you don't exist. Your mind is no longer functioning, and you simply have nothing to think. There is nothing there that can do any thinking, and that's why your thoughts perish. But this is complete misunderstanding of the verse in its context. What does it mean that their thoughts perish? It does not mean their thoughts cease to take place. They no longer are thinking. But rather it means that they're no longer able to do what they had planned to do. I mean, we have this same idiom, or a similar idiom, in modern English, where we say, perish the thought. Perish the thought does not mean, I wish that you would stop thinking. Perish the thought means, it's my wish that what you are thinking doesn't happen. That your thought, your plan, your intention does not come about. And this is what it means in the context. Verse 3 of the same passage, Psalm 146, verse 3. Don't trust in princes or in human beings who cannot deliver you. And then he goes on to say that his spirit, that is the human being or prince in whom you're trusting, his spirit departs. He returns to the earth. In that very day his thoughts perish. Now notice that the spirit departs. There's again a biblical idiom for death that implies the spirit continues to exist just somewhere else. And then he says, in that very day his thoughts perish. In other words, you can't trust in a prince or in another human being because you can't trust in them because they're going to die and they're not going to be able to follow through on their promises. You need to trust in God because God never dies. God can come through and do what he says. So it's simply a matter of not reading the verse in context, not understanding what the psalmist is saying. The most popular proof text, and I've been hit with this at the door numerous times by Jehovah's Witnesses coming to the door. Actually, there's two of them, and they're both in Ecclesiastes. And you're going, what? Ecclesiastes? What's that? You might not even know what that is. That's a book in the Old Testament that is credited to King Solomon, and it's a very unusual book. It's a book that is famous for its refrain that is spoken at the beginning and end of the book. Vanity, all is vanity, which translated in modern idiom, everything is just a big waste of time. Everything is just chasing after wind, Solomon says. And in this context of talking about the vanity of mortal life, the vanity of the uselessness, the wastefulness of ordinary human life, Solomon says some things that Jehovah's Witnesses claim proves that when you die, you cease to exist. He says in Ecclesiastes 3, verses 18 to 21, I said in my heart with regard to human beings that God has tested them to show that they are but animals. They're just animals. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. One dies, so does the other. They all have the same breath, which could be translated spirit, and humans have no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? In other words, Solomon understands that there is a view in his day, current in his day, that when you die, the human spirit goes up into some kind of heavenly or spiritual realm, whereas the spirit of animals just goes down into the earth. But he says, how does anybody know if that's true? Now, Jehovah's Witnesses quote this passage and a similar one in Ecclesiastes 9 as if they prove that the dead simply don't exist. But notice how Solomon introduces this thought. He says, I said in my heart. Now this is a specific way of speaking within the context of Ecclesiastes that tells us this is what Solomon, the author, said to himself. This is what he thought as he thought about life and death from his own point of view. A point of view that he describes repeatedly throughout the book of Ecclesiastes as under the sun. I'm looking at life from an under-the-sun perspective. That is, I'm looking at it from a ground-level point of view, what we might call a worm's eye view. He uses this expression, under the sun, 31 times in Ecclesiastes. And so the context of this is, I wanted wisdom, and I wanted wisdom where I could understand life from human perception, human observation, human experience. What could I know? How could I understand life? What meaning and purpose could I find in life if I had the greatest wisdom that any human being could have, just looking at life, with reason and experience and observation? And his answer is, well, if that's all you've got, the best philosophy you can get is everything is just vanity. It's a waste of time. But that's not the truth that Solomon is trying to teach in this book. What he's trying to teach in this book is, if that's all you've got is human wisdom, that's the best you're going to come up with. But fortunately for us, that's not all we've got. We've got God's revelation. We've got God's point of view from above the sun. Now, let me just read some statements to you, and you tell me, you think about this, you tell me if these statements are true. Everything from a Christian point of view, okay? Just give me, you think about this from a Christian point of view. Everything is a waste of time. Everything is vanity. Nothing new ever happens. Wisdom and knowledge are vain, because they just bring grief. The wise person is no better off than the fool. The best thing to do is just eat, drink, and try to be happy. People are just animals. I already read that one, so you know where I'm getting these. It's better to be dead than alive, and better still to have never existed. A person dies no better off for all his hard work. It doesn't matter how hard you work, when you die, you're no better off. Too much righteousness or too much wisdom will just get you in trouble. It'll ruin you. Better to have a little bit of righteousness, have it in moderation. You don't want to be too much of a goody two-shoes. Just get you into trouble. And the righteous and the wicked will suffer the same fate. Now, if you believe those things, congratulations, you're a humanist. You're not a biblical thinker. And Solomon is not teaching these things. But he says all these things within the context of what he was able to come up with from a perspective under the sun by his own observations and his own experiences. So he's presenting this to show us, to hold up a mirror and say, if you try to trust in your own wisdom and your own smarts and your own philosophy, this is all you're going to get. And, 3,000 years later, philosophy finally caught up with Solomon. Because this is basically the conclusion that a lot of existentialists and other philosophers in the 20th century came up with. They ended up saying, you know what, we can't really see any purpose in life. There isn't one. The problem that they had, though, is they really wanted to believe in one. So what a lot of philosophers have been saying for the last 50 years or so is there is no purpose in life except any purpose that you make up for yourself. So there's no given or real purpose in life, but go out there and make whatever you want of it. Don't worry about it. Ecclesiastes 9, similar passage. Ecclesiastes 9 says, "It is the same for everyone, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, the good and the evil, the clean and the unclean, to the person who sacrifices and to the one that doesn't sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who swears is as he who shuns an oath." This is Ecclesiastes 9, beginning at verse 2. There is an evil in all that is done under the sun. See that key phrase I mentioned? Under the sun, that the same event happens to all. Also the hearts of the children of men are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. It's the saying that people that say all the time, life is just, crap, and then you die. That's basically what Solomon's saying here. Life is terrible, it's full of evil and madness, and then people die. But he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. I've had Jehovah's Witnesses quote this to me. as if this is the truth. This is the final revelation about the nature of death. But in the context of the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is telling us, I tried to live based on my own wisdom, without God, without His revelation, and it doesn't work. The book of Ecclesiastes is written from the perspective of Solomon after he has gone astray and come to his senses and said, you know what? I need God. I need His commandments. I need Him to tell me what to do. I need Him to tell me what the purpose of life is, because there is no purpose of life without God, without God's point of view. And that's what Ecclesiastes is saying. All right, now, trying to just clear some things up here, and I've already said that Christians sometimes use some language that's not biblical, and what they mean by it is. And, I gave the example of people saying, well, you're either going to live forever in heaven or you're going to live forever in hell. And there's a related concept and terminology here that is also misleading in terms of a biblical way of speaking, where we need to get some clarification. And that is the idea of the immortality of the soul. Now, in traditional Catholic doctrinal formulation, the expression the immortality of the soul came to be used to express the biblical idea that when you die, there is something, a spirit, a soul, whatever you want to call it, the invisible, immaterial aspect or component of human existence that continues to exist forever. And that's what immortality of the soul means in a Christian context. The problem is, that's not how the Bible uses the language. And in fact, immortality of the soul is historically a Greek religious pagan concept that means something very different from what the Bible means. Now, this is the point that was made in a classic little book, very short little book. You could read it in an hour, by a German theologian named Oscar Kuhlmann. Who knew you were going to get an education in German theology, in German biblical scholarship, in a discussion on Jehovah's Witnesses? Oscar Kuhlmann was a mid-20th century German theologian, biblical scholar, who gave a lecture that was later published into a short little book called Immortality of the Soul or Resurrection of the Dead. Immortality of the Soul or Resurrection of the Dead. And it's interesting that both Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists think they really like this book. They quote from it. They refer to it as supposedly proving that the historic Orthodox Christian belief that the soul or spirit exists after the death of the body is an unbiblical concept, because Oscar Kuhlmann's thesis in this lecture and short little book is, the Bible doesn't teach immortality of the soul, it teaches resurrection from the dead. Now, that is exactly what Oscar Kuhlmann said, but by immortality of the soul he did not mean the existence of the soul after death. What he meant was the idea that the ultimate end result of human existence will be a soul that lives in Sheol, or that their term was Hades, or some kind of realm of the dead forever. So, what is it that Kuhlmann is saying? I want to draw some contrasts here between immortality of the soul and resurrection of the dead, and all of these come out of Oscar Kuhlmann's book. And when you draw these contrasts properly, according to a biblical theological perspective like Kuhlmann is doing, you will see that his problem is not with the idea that the soul exists after death, but with the idea that the soul is the ultimate and essential component of human existence, and the body is a useless or annoying appendage. So here are the contrasts. Number one, immortality of the soul teaches that the soul is imprisoned in the body, that the body is the prison of the soul. Resurrection of the dead teaches that the soul belongs in the body. God's purpose for human beings is that their bodies be alive with the soul united to that body in one indivisible whole being. So Christianity teaches that the soul belongs in the body. The Greeks thought the soul was imprisoned in the body. Number 2, immortality of the soul teaches that the body is inherently evil, and that's why the soul needs to get out of it. The soul needs to abandon the body because the body is dragging it. It's a drag on the soul. Resurrection of the body teaches that the body is inherently good, yet it is corrupted by evil and so needs to be redeemed. So, to make it a little bit briefer here, immortality of the soul holds that the body needs to be abandoned because it's just bad. Resurrection of the dead teaches that the body needs to be redeemed. It's good yet corrupted. Immortality of the soul teaches that human death is a natural passage from a lower to a higher form of life. A friend. Death is a friend. You welcome it. You embrace it. You prepare for it as the passage into a higher form of life. And this is a very popular concept in Christianity today. I will not deny that. This is a widespread belief that death is this wonderful friend that just takes us peacefully from one realm to another, just takes us from a lower form of life to a higher form of life. But this is not the biblical view. The resurrection of the dead view is that human death is an enemy. It's a curse. It's the consequence of sin. That death is a passage from life to a shady, incomplete state of existence. And Pullman describes that. He's quite clear on that point. It's not a passage from death. Death is not a passage from life to non-existence, like the Jehovah's Witnesses say, nor is it a passage from a lower form of life to a higher form of life, like the Greeks thought, but rather death is a passage from this life to a lesser kind of life, a lesser kind of existence, really, that couldn't even be described as life. Number 4, immortality of the soul teaches that everybody possesses immortality of the soul. It doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter how you live. We all have immortal souls. And again, unfortunately, many Christians have fallen into this terminological error of saying that all human souls are immortal. But this is not the biblical view. The biblical view, the view of resurrection of the body, of the resurrection of the dead, is that all human beings will be judged, and only those who are redeemed will receive immortal life. And this immortal life will be a bodily life, not just immortality of the soul, but immortality of the whole person. So again, the contrast here, which is very important, is that immortality of the soul in Greek thought was everybody is immortal. Everybody is an immortal being trapped in this annoying physical body. We just need to escape it. This is a concept found in Gnosticism. Today it's a concept found in Scientology. I don't know if you knew that. That's exactly what Scientologists believe. We are all thetans, which are these sort of divine beings, souls, these divine spirits, these divine entities called thetans, and we decided to play around in the mud of physicality and got trapped in these bodies and forgot that we were gods. That's the cosmology, the theology of Scientology. It's not the cosmology of the Bible. It's not the theology of the Bible. Number 5, when you die, you immediately attain the full state of blessedness in immortality of the soul. You just quietly pass from this life to the next, and you're there. You're done. You've made it. End of story. In the biblical concept of the resurrection of the dead, when you die, you don't cease to exist, but even if you're righteous, you're not complete. You're still awaiting the resurrection of the dead. You're still awaiting your own resurrection to immortality and the completion of your salvation. So that there is an intermediate state for the dead where they're awaiting their final disposition. One more, I need to cut this short because there's so many here, but one more. In immortality of the soul, immortality involves passing from the material world to the immaterial world. You pass from the physical realm to the spiritual realm. You stop living in the physical and you live in the spiritual, in the immaterial. In the biblical doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, that's not it. In resurrection, immortality involves passing from this age to the age to come. You stop living in the here and now of this present age, which is an age of corruption and death and sin and conflict, and you begin to live in the coming age, the age to come, through the resurrection, in an age of blessedness, life, peace, wholeness, completion, and never, ever dying again. So it's the age to come, rather than just passing into an immaterial world. Well, a lot more that could be said here, but I need to move on. And I'm sure that there are going to be some questions here because I have not been able to get to nearly everything. Ezekiel 18 verse 4 says, "The soul who sins will die." The soul who sins will die. So, you see, in biblical terminology, the soul is not inherently immortal. The soul can die. In fact, the soul will die if the soul sins. And all souls sin. all human souls have sinned, except for the soul of Jesus Christ. So we're all going to die. Our souls are going to die. They are going to be cut off from the land of the living. They're going to pass into a realm of existence that's not what it needs to be, what it was meant to be. And the only hope of getting out of that is a miracle of God in redeeming our souls from the pit, from death. So the soul is not inherently immortal. Immortality is a blessing of redemption that is given to those who are redeemed by God's grace through faith. Moving right along here, and I apologize for having to zip through a lot of this stuff. Ezekiel, moving past the Ezekiel passage, jumping up to Matthew 10:28, a verse I think is a really helpful verse here. Jesus says, "Don't fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul." Don't fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna, in hell. Now, those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, that would be human beings. Another human being might be able to kill your body, Jesus says, but they cannot kill your soul. Because the soul, although it's not immortal, is not something that other people can kill. But he says, rather fear him, and that has to be God, who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. In other words, God has control over what happens to your soul and not just your body. Well, now this makes it pretty clear, doesn't it, that the soul exists beyond the death of the physical body. That the soul is not simply the life of the body, but is somehow distinct from it. That's Matthew 10:28. All right, gotta zip along here. What happens then after you die? Well, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, according to the New Testament, you don't simply go to some rather unpleasant realm of the dead, which is what everybody in the Old Testament was looking forward to, and it wasn't something that they were looking forward to, if you get my drift. But if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you have the wonderful hope of being able to live in the presence of God, in heaven in some sense. Here's a classic text on this point, Luke 23:43, where Jesus says to the repentant thief on the cross next to him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now, Jehovah's Witnesses recognize that the implication of this verse is, on that very day that Jesus and the thief both died, both of them went to some spiritual realm called paradise. That won't do. So the New World Translation, and they got this idea from the Adventists, as far as I can tell, translate Luke 23:43 in this way. Truly I tell you today, comma, you will be with me in paradise. Now, it would really help, I suppose, if the ancient Greek manuscripts had commas, but for all practical purposes they didn't. Once in a blue moon you'll see a dot somewhere indicating some kind of a break that could be equivalent to a comma. In the vast majority of manuscripts at Luke 23:43 you won't find any such dot. There is one manuscript where there might be a dot, or it might just be the guy was a little careless with his pen. Scholars aren't sure. But there is no comma ordinarily in ancient Greek manuscripts. So how do you tell where to put the comma in English? Well, you tell by looking at the way the language is put together in the sentence and noting patterns of sentence structure. That's how you do it in all cases. And in this case, we have a very clear indication as to where the break comes, because this expression, truly I tell you, is an expression found in the New Testament only on the lips of Jesus. It is original with Jesus. Jesus is the only one that ever talked that way. And when he would introduce a statement with the words, literally, Amen, I tell you, or Amen, I say to you. 3 Greek words. And Amen, I say to you was his way of introducing a profound, surprising, or solemn truth. In other words, listen up. I got something pretty shocking or surprising to tell you, but I'm telling you this is the truth. And after he would say that, Amen, I tell you, the truth that he wanted to say would come next. And he uses this expression over 70 times in the Gospels. Guess what? In the New World Translation, the only place where the break does not come immediately after, truly I tell you, is in Luke 23:43. That's the only place. Why do they put the break after today, whereas in all the other places in the Gospels where Jesus says, truly I tell you, they put the break immediately after the word you? It's theology. All right? It's because it doesn't fit their eschatology. It doesn't fit their view of the afterlife. And so, to make the verse conform to what they've already decided to believe, they put the comma where, frankly, it just does not belong. Now, there's a lot of other things that could be said about Luke 23:43, but I'm going to pass over those. And I want to talk now a little bit about the resurrection, and I'm already running out of time here. Now, I said last week, we did talk about this, that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a physical resurrection. It's a resurrection of his physical body. The same body that died was resurrected from the grave, came back to life by the power of God. Now, this is extremely important, and it makes shipwreck of Jehovah's Witness theology in so many ways. But one way that I want to mention is that it destroys the concept of the two classes of Christians, the two classes of the redeemed of humanity at the end of time, the end of history. Because Jehovah's Witnesses maintain that there are, as I said, two classes of the redeemed. The vast majority of redeemed human beings will live on the earth. The earth will be renovated, remodeled, cleaned up during the millennium. And this is not a caricature. This is exactly what Jehovah's Witnesses teach. That the reason for the millennium is that it will take 1,000 years to clean up the mess that human beings left behind when Armageddon was over and the millennium begins. There will be a 1,000-year cleanup operation to make the earth a paradise to live in. The vast majority of saved people will live on the earth. They will never see God. They will never see Christ. They might occasionally see an angel. I don't know about that. But they won't ever actually see God or Christ. God and Christ will stay in heaven. The vast, vast majority of redeemed people will live on the earth. But there is an exception. There is a group of people who are going to live in heaven. In fact, practically all of them are already there. And there is an exact number given to us in the Bible of these people, according to Jehovah's Witnesses. And that number is 144,000. Now, if you know your Bible, you know that this number only shows up twice in the same book, in the book of Revelation, in chapters 7 and 14. A lot of sevens here. 7, 14, 144,000. Lots of multiples of 7. So, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, the redeemed will live on the earth except for a kind of elite core who will go to heaven and will live in heaven as spirit creatures like angels. They will have spirit bodies, which we talked about last week is an oxymoron. But the Jehovah's Witnesses maintain that the 144,000, whom they call the anointed class, will live in heaven as spirit beings with spirit bodies like the angels and like Jesus's. And of course, if Jesus has a physical body, this whole theology falls to pieces because they agree that the anointed class will have bodies like Christ's. Well, if Jesus rose in a physical body, then that's out the window. But Jehovah's Witnesses think that the Bible teaches this idea that the 144,000 are going to be a special class of believers going to heaven, whereas the millions or even billions of other sheep, as they're called, the other sheep, are going to be living on the earth. Now, here again, Christians have some different ideas about the interpretation of the 144,000. I don't want to argue about this, so I'm just going to tell you that there are two main interpretations of Revelation 7 and the 144,000 in historic Orthodox Christian interpretation. In no particular order, one view is that the 144,000 represent a literal 144,000 Jews, because in Revelation 7 they're said to be from the 12 tribes of Israel. And so some Christians believe that this refers to 144,000 literal Jews. So the number of Jews is literal, the fact that they are Jews is literal, the fact that they're from the 12 tribes is literal. In other words, this is an interpretation that takes the passage as literally as possible. That's the goal anyway, to take it as literally as possible. And this is usually correlated with a particular eschatology and a particular interpretation of the book of Revelation that says that these 144,000 Jews will be recent converts to belief to Jesus, recent converts to faith in Christ, perhaps sometime around or during, in the middle of the tribulation period, which is generally thought to be a 7-year period that precedes the second coming of Christ. Now, there's a lot of eschatological speculations and theories here that I don't want to argue about, but the point is that this view is consistent in saying the number 144,000 is literal, the number 12,000 from each tribe is literal, the number of the tribes is literal, the tribes are literal, the Jews are literal, it's all literal. Okay? It's a consistent view. The other view that's in Christianity that was the majority view until recently, and now, at least among evangelicals, it's a minority view, I guess, is the view that the 144,000 is a symbolic picture, not a literal description of, but a symbolic picture of the church. And that it pictures the church as the new Israel, if you will, and boy, those are fighting words, or a kind of a spiritual Israel. It's another way of putting it that people might not like, but that it's a picture of the church. Now, on this view, the Jews are figurative, the 12 tribes are figurative, and the number 144,000 is figurative. So this view is a consistently figurative interpretation of Revelation 7. Now, I think you might be able to see where I'm going here. Jehovah's Witnesses have the worst of both possible interpretations, if you will. They understand the 144,000 to refer to the church, which they call the Christian congregation. And they understand the Christian congregation will be composed of both Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus. This is very much like the traditional Christian view. But the number is a literal number. The 144,000 number, that is. The 12 tribes, that number 12 is not literal. The 12,000 from each tribe, that number is not literal. The Jews are not literal. But the number 144,000 is literal. In other words, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, the only thing that they take literally in the passage is the number 144,000. They don't take any of the other numbers literally, and they don't take the Jews literally, and they don't take the tribes literally. Now, what sense does that make? I mean, honestly, I don't understand what sense it makes. It is an interpretation driven by an historical happenstance. What happenstances am I referring to? Well, very simply. Jehovah's Witnesses, before they were even known as Jehovah's Witnesses, called Bible students, led by Charles Taze Russell, arrogantly believed that the only true Christians who were part of this elite fellowship of Christians who were going to go to heaven were, in their day, people who were associated with Charles Taze Russell and his Bible students. And of course, there were Christians in the first century, and there were a smattering of Christians throughout the centuries between the first century and Russell's day, but only a few thousand probably. And they figured that the end was coming any day, and so they were confident that the number of Jehovah's Witnesses, as they later were called, or the number of Bible students, was not going to exceed 144,000. So that the number of the saints, the number of believers that were part of this Christian congregation or church would never exceed 144,000. Well, 1914 came and went. Jehovah's Witnesses got their name in the 20s, and they continued to grow, and they grew way past the number 144,000. And so, frankly, they had a little problem on their hands as a result of their success. They converted just too many people. And they could no longer sustain this idea that all of the Jehovah's Witnesses would be part of this 144,000 that went to heaven. So they came up with the two-tiered system of salvation. Some people go to heaven, some people don't. Some people go to be with God in Christ, some people stay on the earth and never see God in Jesus. In fact, as the Jehovah's Witnesses grew, became much more numerous, became obvious that Jehovah's Witnesses needed to have a theology in which the vast majority of people would not go to heaven. And so they ended up with a city in the clouds theology that says the elite core of spiritual leaders, and in fact, the 144,000, the anointed class, is also, by coincidence, no, I don't think so, the ranks from which the leaders of the Jehovah's Witness religion come. In other words, you have to be a leader in the Jehovah's Witness religion, you are normally expected to be a member of the anointed class. Now that's going by the wayside as well, because the number of people that they admit being part of the anointed class is dwindling. It's less than 10,000, and it'll continue to dwindle. So they've got a little problem on their hands there. The clock is ticking against them on that. But the point I'm making here is that they were forced into this two-tiered salvation system by the fact of their own success. They got to be too numerous, and so they had to make an adjustment in their eschatology. Now, I'm afraid Christians' response to this idea tends to be a little less than adequate, may I put it that way? Because you know what most Christians want to say. They want to say, all Christians go to heaven, period. And so they're very offended at the idea that only 144,000 Christians go to heaven, and the vast majority of Christians are supposed to get stuck on the earth and live on this earth. Well, who wants to stay here? We want to go to heaven. And so Christians often say this. Unfortunately, when they say this, they don't understand biblical eschatology. Because in biblical eschatology, the end goal of human existence, of human salvation, is not simply living as spirits in heaven. You know, the popular conception which we see in the movies and It's a Wonderful Life and, The Blue Bird with Shirley Temple, if you saw that, that's years and years ago before your time probably, and many other movies, is that, human beings die and they go to heaven, they become angels, or at least angel-like beings, and they just live in heaven. And if that's true, well, where is the resurrection in this scenario? It's just not there. And this is a vulnerability in many people's eschatology that Jehovah's Witnesses will exploit with abandon, because it is unbiblical. Now, here's the problem. It's incomplete. When you die, your spirit goes to heaven, if you're a Christian. Your spirit goes to be with Christ, Philippians 1, verses 21 to 24, which Jehovah's Witnesses mangle, and I don't have time to get into how they mangle it, but believe me, they mangle it. When you die, your spirit or soul goes to be with Christ, awaiting the resurrection. When the resurrection takes place at the end of this age, your body will be reunited with your spirit or soul, and you will be a whole person again, a whole human being again, body and soul, and you will live in what the New Testament calls the new heavens and new earth. You will be resurrected to immortal bodily life, immortal physical life, living in a physical realm, what is called the new heavens and new earth, which is a biblical way of saying the new universe. So the picture here is similar, or it's built on the biblical teaching about Jesus. Jesus lived as a mortal man on the earth. He was raised from the dead and went to heaven. And he's coming back to the earth. Did you ever wonder why he's coming back to the earth? You think he's coming back to the earth just to swoop people off the earth? No, he's coming back to, and I'm not even talking about the rapture here. I'm talking about the end result, at the end of this, the final second coming of Christ. What is Jesus doing? He's coming to the earth to judge the living and the dead. He's coming to the earth to set up the eternal kingdom of God. And in biblical theology, when believers are taken to heaven, it's temporary, because they're going to be raised to immortal life in the new earth, the new heavens and new earth. God is going to dwell with human beings. He's going to come down and live with us. That's what Revelation 21 says. The dwelling place of God is now among people. Revelation 21. So we're going to live in the new heavens and new earth. Now, what is that like? I don't know. What relationship does that new heavens and new earth have to the heaven and earth that we're living in now? Christians debate that. But we know a few things. We know it's going to be physical. We know it's also going to be immortal, where there's not going to be any more death, not going to be any more disease, not going to be any more sin, or any of the consequences of sin. We know that only the righteous, the redeemed, because of what Christ did for us on the cross, will live in that new heavens and new earth. We know that we will have immortality. We know that we will see God. Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Not just 144,000 of them will see God, but all of the pure in heart. And of course, you're pure in heart by the grace of God. If you trust in Jesus Christ, you're made pure in heart. So we're going to live in the new heavens and new earth. We're going to be resurrected beings with physical bodies that are very unlike the ones that we have now, because they're going to be totally glorious and fantastic and immortal and impervious to death and, not susceptible anymore to temptations of the flesh, but they'll still be physical beings. We also know that we're all going to be together. There is no separation in biblical eschatology between those who live in heaven and those who live on the earth. No city in the clouds theology. We know that we're all going to be with God, and we're all going to be with Christ. We're going to be with Him. We're going to live with Him. The Bible never separates believers into those who get to be with Jesus and those who don't. By the way, the Mormons make the same mistake. The Mormons claim that there are three heavens. They got a three-tier system. We talked about that a little bit, I think. But Jehovah's Witnesses have it down to 2. So, now, there's one other aspect of this I want to mention before I get into questions, and I've run over time for the lecture, but there's a lot to cover here, and I am going to open up for questions, and we'll go past 11:30. It's no problem. But this doctrine of the anointed class being distinct from the other sheep, the many who go to live in paradise earth, it turns out it makes a total wreck of the New Testament, because Jehovah's Witnesses have had to admit that almost everything that you find in the epistles applies to the anointed class, because the epistles talk about being children of God and being with God and being with Christ and all these other things that are associated in Jehovah's Witness theology with being part of the anointed class. In fact, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, some really surprising things only apply to the anointed class. For example, justification by faith. That only applies to the anointed class. Only the anointed class can partake of the elements in their once-a-year Lord's Supper, which they called the memorial. Only the anointed class. And that means that, I don't remember the exact number, 7,000 or 8,000 Jehovah's Witnesses are part of the anointed class today. As I said, the number has dwindled considerably from their heyday. And there's, a few million Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. That means that there's less than 1 in 100 Jehovah's Witnesses. It's closer to 1 in 1,000. It's getting close to 1 in 1,000. It's like 1 in 300, 1 in 400, something like that. Jehovah's Witnesses is a member of the anointed class. And that means that once a year when they get together for this memorial service, only 1 in every 300 or 400 partakes of the elements. Well, that's that's kind of being kind of awkward. You're passing around the elements in a service, and only one person takes out of every 2 or 3 or 400. That's kind of bizarre. Well, that's because they're the only ones that are allowed to, because they're the only ones that are part of that covenant relationship called the church or the Christian congregation. Only the 144,000 are part of the church. And so Jehovah's Witnesses constantly have to say when they read the New Testament, is this talking about everybody or just the anointed class? And see, Christians don't have to ask that question because they take what the New Testament says, at its obvious meaning when it says that everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ, everyone who trusts in Him as the Messiah is born of God, not just 144,000 of them. By the way, that's another one. The new birth, that's only for the anointed class, because that's a reference to being prepared for spiritual life in the heavens, which is not a biblical understanding of what Jesus meant. So, as you can see, it ripples throughout the New Testament and ripples throughout the theology of Jehovah's Witnesses and causes havoc and disaster everywhere it goes. And this is why back in around 1980 there was a big upset in the Watchtower headquarters when some Jehovah's Witnesses got a little bit too studious and read their Bibles a little bit too carefully and realized this whole thing is a stack of cards. It's a house of cards, and it won't work biblically to separate the anointed class out from the other sheep. Well, I've gone all over the place here with the eschatology of Jehovah's Witnesses. I've probably stepped on some toes in terms of your own eschatology. I do want to address one question here that I see Pete asks, and that is, what does Christ mean by his statement in John 14, I go to prepare a place for you? Now, this just cannot, in the context, mean that Jesus is going to heaven to, sort of build some mansions for people to live in, or they have to expand the mansion of heaven to include some extra rooms for new believers. What Jesus is saying is he's going to heaven to prepare for what, in this kind of physical terminology is called a place, but he's really talking about preparing for the new age, the age to come. He's talking about getting ready for the new heavens and new earth, which is going to come to us in the consummation of God's purposes. So he's not saying, I'm going up to heaven because I got to build some extra houses or extra rooms for you. But what he's saying is, first of all, when you die, again, your spirit will go to be with Christ in heaven, and you'll be fine there. You won't be suffering, but you also won't be complete, because ultimately what God has in store for you is the resurrection life that Jesus himself had when he rose from the dead. And so John 14 only addresses part of that, and if you try to make that the whole picture, you end up with some distortion. All right, I need to stop and open this up for questions. We will be giving precedent or priority to those of you who have TTP in your name there, because that indicates that you're a member of the theology program course. And so I do want to give you priority. I believe somebody else here is actually going to be moderating the discussion, though, so I'll let that person take care of that, whoever it is that does that. And do be aware that we have limited times, but I will stay longer than we planned so that we can have good amount of discussion. The quizzes should be ready, and also the keys are ready, so when you turn those in, Carrie will be able to score them and tell you how you did. But I'm going to get off the microphone here. If you have a question that you can use the microphone to express, you can do that. If you want to type a question, the moderator will read the question, and then I will attempt to answer it as time permits.
Okay, Rob. Larry has a question that he typed. He says, when the apostles witnessed the transfiguration, what sort of bodies did Moses and Elijah then have? Were they resurrection bodies? They seem to appear to be physical in nature.
Well, that's a good question, Larry, and I say that's a good question because we really don't know. Obviously, they appeared in some kind of human form, or in terms of their appearance. There is nothing said to indicate that they actually were physical in nature. That is, no one touches Elijah, no one shakes hands with Moses. Moses doesn't eat fish as Jesus did after he rose from the dead. There is no there is nothing in the description that leads us to believe that they were necessarily physical. Although again, they had there was an imagery there of being human in appearance. So we don't know. My understanding of biblical eschatology is that the resurrection body is received at the end of history, and therefore Moses and Elijah would not have had their resurrection bodies at this time. Now, there are people that hold a different view. There's some room here for discussion and debate even within Orthodox Christianity, but my understanding is that they would not have had their resurrection bodies per se. Could be that what we're seeing is a kind of glimpse or a preview of what their resurrection bodies would have looked like, and in fact what Jesus' resurrection body might have looked like. And many people have argued that the transfiguration is meant to be understood as Jesus giving his disciples a kind of sneak preview of what the resurrection would look like. But that doesn't mean that Moses and Elijah had actually resurrected from the dead or received their immortal bodies. There are a lot of things here. I don't want to get sidetracked with too many of these things. Elijah, from what we can see in Kings, didn't actually die. Nobody knows what happened exactly to the body of Moses either. So, people have had some speculations about this. I don't want to get into all that, but just to say that one thing is fairly clear. There's every reason to believe from that passage that Elijah and Moses existed. That it really was Elijah and Moses. Nothing in the text would suggest that this wasn't Elijah and Moses. Of course, it couldn't be Elijah and Moses in truth if the Jehovah's Witnesses are right and death is non-existent. So it does raise some issues for their particular theology.
Okay, and Bethel Pastor, go ahead. You have the mic. Okay, I guess he doesn't have a mic. Rob, he says, what is paradise earth? Is it the new earth for the second class? I assume he's talking about Jehovah's Witness theology.
Yes, paradise earth is, in Jehovah's Witness lingo, the term used for the earth that will, this earth, as it's cleaned up and renovated and beautified into a paradise condition, but it's still the same exact earth, but just, totally, complete extreme makeover, Earth edition, and it's going to be, fantastic, and but it's all going to be done by the hard labor of faithful Jehovah's Witnesses and other worthy ones who are resurrected to live in the paradise earth during the millennium. They are the second class, if you will, of believers of the redeemed. Now, again, biblical eschatology has a place for the new earth, but it is part of the entire redeemed cosmos, the new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells, 2 Peter 3:13, and all believers will be united with God in Christ together in this redeemed earth, this new earth, according to Revelation 21. There will not be a separation into a heavenly class and an earthly class.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Very good. Did that answer your question? Okay, Alan, you're up next. You have a mic?
Okay, praise God. Anyway, Jesus said that he would make a new heaven and a new earth. This new earth that Jesus said he would create, it is spoken of, I believe, in Revelations, that it would have no seas, that Jerusalem would be its main city. Can you help me out with this?
Revelation 21 and 22 talks about the new heavens and new earth, and it talks about the city of New Jerusalem. Now, Christians have some different opinions about the New Jerusalem, and I'm going to just be very frank with you and tell you what my opinion is. Revelation 21, verse 9, identifies the New Jerusalem as the bride, the wife of the Lamb. The wife of the Lamb. Now, anybody who is familiar with Paul will know that this is an equivalent expression for the bride of Christ, which is the church. And so my understanding is that the imagery of the New Jerusalem, a city coming out of heaven down to the earth, is a symbolic, visionary picture of the church resurrected from the dead, restored to the new heavens and new earth in full glory and immortality, to live forever in God's kingdom with Christ forever, and that it's a picture of the church. Now, people have different ways of reading the book of Revelation, and I understand that. There are people who argue that the city of the New Jerusalem is a literal cube city, because it's described as in shape as a cube. An extremely large cube city that literally is going to come down out of the sky and either rest on the earth or hover above the earth. And I'm sorry, this is the Trekkie in me. I always think of the Borg when I hear this imagery. But of course, this is a benevolent city, not a malevolent cube city. But nevertheless, that's kind of the picture some Christians have. This is a literal, physical, cube-shaped city that's going to come down out of the sky and maybe come down and rest on the earth. I just honestly don't think that's the point. I honestly think that when the book of Revelation tells you what something is, you need to take that seriously. And it tells us in Revelation 21, verse 9, that the New Jerusalem, the city, is the wife of the Lamb. The Lamb, of course, is Jesus Christ. We all know that. The Lamb is a representation, a symbolic representation in the book of Revelation for Jesus Christ. The wife of the Lamb is the church. And so I would argue that, and this Revelation 21 verses 2 and 9, if you compare those two verses, you'll see that I think you'll see that this is made fairly clear, that the city of New Jerusalem is a symbolic picture of the church. And I would argue, just as the city of Babylon the Great is a symbolic representation of all the anti-Christ, anti-God forces of this world, the New Jerusalem, the city that comes down out of heaven, is a representation of the people of God, the redeemed. It's what Augustine called the two cities, the city of God and the city of man. The city of God is the church. It's the redeemed, not just Christians, but all of the redeemed people of all ages. All the Old Testament saints, as well as all the New Testament saints. All of the people whom God redeems through Christ, Old and New Testament. And they will all be this city of God, this city that comes down from heaven. It's a symbolic picture of the church. And Babylon the Great is a symbolic picture of the anti-God forces of this world. Now, that's one way of reading the book of Revelation many of us are not familiar with. I would really encourage you to study different approaches to the book of Revelation, make up your own mind. I'm not trying to proselytize for this particular understanding, but this is my view. And you may be trying to say, well, how does that relate to your view of the millennium? I'm not even going to get into all that. Okay, you asked me that. I'm not even going to answer it today because I want to focus on what's really wrong with the Jehovah's Witness eschatology, where evangelical Orthodox eschatology, regardless of your views on the millennium and the rapture and the tribulation and the Antichrist and all that, where we all should line up and agree, which is Jesus Christ rose physically from the grave to immortal life. All who believe in him will likewise be resurrected to immortal physical life in the new heavens and new earth. We receive this immortality by grace through faith in Christ, not by our works. How you get to the new heavens and new earth is much more important than all the details of what it's going to be like, or trying to construct a time chart or a timeline of how it's going to all play out, or trying to guess who the Antichrist is, or trying to guess when Jesus is going to come back. Charles Taze Russell can be criticized for a lot of things, but he cannot be criticized for starting this kind of speculation. The people who started it were people who came long before Russell. The people who turned it into a kind of regular pastime for evangelicals were the Adventists who came along in the 1840s. But evangelicals have been doing it. They did it throughout the 20th century. Hal Lindsey wrote a book, the 1980s were a countdown to Armageddon. Edgar Weissnant was an evangelical who claimed to have 88 reasons why Jesus was going to come back in 1988. And they seem to have a plausible sounding biblical argument for that. That turned out to be wrong. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is I'm not trying to change your views on the millennium or the tribulation or the rapture. I'm not trying to even touch those things. I'm saying we've got to learn to do eschatology in a biblical way. We've got to learn to major on the majors and leave the minors alone, or at least not major on them. We've got to make the majors the focus of our eschatology, and we've got to learn to think biblically about the new heavens and new earth, and not have this kind of simplistic, half-Christian, half-pagan eschatology that says, well, everybody is immortal, and when you die, you just go to a higher place. And if you believe in Jesus, that might help, but everyone's going to go somewhere, and everyone's going to have eternal life. And this is not a biblical eschatology. We've got to restore the resurrection from the dead to its rightful place in our eschatology. And that's, if we can do that, we will have a much more effective, potent, biblically grounded understanding of these things to be able to respond to Jehovah's Witnesses. If we don't, frankly, we're sitting ducks for the Jehovah's Witnesses who come along and say, what's your problem? The Bible clearly teaches that there's going to be a new earth. So I'm just asking you to broaden your eschatology. I'm not asking you to make any radical changes to it, unless you really didn't believe in a resurrection from the dead, in which case I guess I am asking you to make a radical change in your eschatology. But many of us, I'm afraid, believe in it but don't know what to do with it. And that's what we need to learn how to do. We need to learn how to have an eschatology that puts these things all in their proper place and majors on the majors. That was a little got off there for a little while. Are there any other questions or comments? I do want to give you some time because we did go over time with the lecture.
Does anybody have any other questions? It's getting on towards midnight there where you are, Rob, or where some of you are. Yeah. We should probably let you bow out of here and go to bed. Rob, we very much appreciate your being here with us for the last 8 weeks.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming and spending this time, and especially those of you who've been with me all 8 weeks. Really appreciate it. Lots of really good questions and comments. I hope that this has not just given you a better understanding of Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, but also a better understanding of your own faith, of the Bible and its teachings, and perhaps whetted your appetite for more. That'll provoke you to get into a study of some of these things that we've talked about, where perhaps I've said some things that were a little bit different from what you heard when you first became a Christian, or from what you've been familiar with, and you're maybe now interested in studying that a little bit more, and that's great. And if you end up disagreeing with me about something, well, you're just a heretic. That's all there is to it. No, I'm just kidding. I hope that you will just take seriously the importance of learning Christian doctrine, of studying the Bible, and listening to other Christians, and even if you disagree with them. And you can also learn just by comparing what Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and other groups say with the Bible. It forces me to really wrestle with these kinds of questions. Especially studying Jehovah's Witnesses when I was a young person, really taking seriously their claims, looking at what the Bible said, and I really wanted to know the truth. And I thank God for that, because that really propelled me into a study of the Bible in a great way, that beyond anything I had done before, and really helped me to learn Scripture. And so I hope that has been your experience a little bit with this course. If you have questions or comments that you wanted to get to me, but we didn't have time to do that, you can learn how to get in touch with me from Carrie. She'll be able to provide that information. And I do hope that if you get a chance, that you'll take a look at this book, Sense and Nonsense About Heaven and Hell, because I think that it'll really help if this is a subject of interest to you. I can honestly say there isn't anything else like it. There's a lot of books about heaven and hell, but not too many that try to go through all the different biblical issues here, and focusing on dealing with groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. So if that's of interest to you, then I think you'll like that book. But anyway, I just really want to thank you for this time and your participation, those of you who've been here every week. It's been a blessing to me. I appreciate the fact that we've had people here who are not just evangelical Christians, but we've also had, I think, Catholics, and I think we've had some Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and so I appreciate all of you being a part of this, and I hope that we get to do this again. I enjoy these courses, and I know that there's some talk about maybe trying to come up with some other topic to do later on this year, and if that works out, I'll sure look forward to that. So thanks a lot, everybody, and bye-bye.